200 countries are gathered. As we speak, representatives from 200 countries are gathered around the negotiating table in France for the Paris climate talks, as the global community works to adapt to the world's changing climate and its ramifications for the human race. Coming up on Outlook, we're going to take a look at what that means for us in Kentucky. And later in the program, your carbon footprint. Can you really get greener? We're going to talk about that next on Outlook. Stay with us. Now, all those Shrek people out there saying, hello and welcome to this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us. Well, is it gloom or doom and doom, or just simply being proactive? The Paris climate talks are underway, and what does that really mean for those of us living here in Kentucky? We're going to take a closer look as we welcome the Assistant Director of the State Climate Center. It's the Kentucky Climate Center. Dr. Rezaul Mahmood joins us. Thank you so much for being here. A climatologist as well. And Dr. David Keeling, always a pleasure to have you on the program, of WKU's Geology and Geography Department, a geopolitician. That's his specialty, I would say. So before we get started, I've been hearing so much about the climate talks, and I can remember in this very studio nearly 2 decades ago having guests on at different times, one guest saying there's no such thing as global warming, the climate's not changing, and on the other hand, guests who would say absolutely it is. So where do you stand on this?
Well, based on the current science, that's where we go. It's not my opinion.
Follow the science.
Follow the science is that climate is changing and that science is very robust. And that change is based on that science. Is humans are the primary driver of that change. When I say that, it also need to be taken into account that climate has always changed every so many thousand years. It has changed.
Even with no humans,
exactly.
That's
a natural variability. We had ice age. We are in a natural warming period in between ice age, and someday we'll get to the ice age. But it doesn't mean that humans cannot influence it. So that's what we are doing onto that there is all the scientific evidence, that's what it suggests. And the other part I would like the audience to know that, the debate, when scientists do debate, it is not about the main concept we are throwing around. It's more of an accuracy. We debate about, is it 0.01 or is it 0.02?
Okay.
We want to
the
be
specifics.
very accurate about it. Those are the debates or methodology. This is the best way to approach it, or that is the best way to approach it, but not challenging the basic underlying hypothesis.
I gotcha.
Yes.
So, but from the geopolitical standpoint, why all of a sudden, why this urgency, or why this renewed emphasis on this climate summit? This isn't the first climate summit.
No, there's 2 reasons, Barbara, that I think there's more focus. One is that we're in an age of global communication, so we have more access to the quintessential picture of a polar bear on a melting piece of ice, which sort of drives the discussion. But we're also in an era where we have so many resource and cultural challenges based on territories and people and societies that the impacts of changing climates exacerbate the underlying geopolitical problems. And so those people that are up to speed with what's been happening in Syria, for example, are probably aware that the root cause of the Syrian conflict was something related to climate change, droughts that exacerbated the flow of people from rural to urban areas. And so there's a reason why we need to sort of look at this from an apolitical standpoint and think about the impact on human beings and what climate changes will do to us here in Kentucky, in the United States, across the globe, because everything now is connected.
So we can't, and you know, you and I spoke earlier, and we were talking about, we haven't seen much climate change to date in the state of Kentucky. As a climatologist, you told me that. But what you also pointed out, and it speaks to what you just said, until you feel an impact, when you can see the polar bears, if they are your neighbors and suddenly they're on melting ice, right? But if you see drought, if you see, you know, that's when it begins to make a difference.
Yes, and as I mentioned, that what happens in this interconnected world, that if Florida get an ice storm and all the fruits and vegetable got, you know,
Ruined.
basically lose the produce and the harvest, then the price goes up. So we are here in Kentucky, maybe nothing happened, everything is perfect, but when you go to the grocery store, we will be paying more, you know, paying more for the fruits
So when
and
it
vegetables.
hits the pocketbook.
Right, exactly. And not only that, think of Hurricane Katrina, that the people migrated, thousands of people out of New Orleans to different parts of the country. So it could be coastal flooding in Florida, but people may be migrating and spreading out all over the places, and we need to you know, accommodate them. We are accommodating refugees from all over the world. So this is our internal, you know, there's the whole term of climate refugees.
Climate refugees, like from
right,
Katrina.
exactly, right.
So we really do need to look, you know, while you're here in the Commonwealth and, as you say, maybe not seeing signs, we'd be naive to think that we're not affected in some
Well,
way.
we're all interrelated, and if you think about, you know, next year we'll celebrate 240 years of the establishment of the United States as a political entity, right? That's a long period of time in human memory, but it's a glip in the sort of the life cycle of the planet. We had less than 1 billion people on the planet when the United States declared its independence. We now have 7.5 billion people on this planet, ever more reliant and interconnected than 200 plus years ago. And so whatever happens to the climate in any part of the world is ultimately going to affect people right here in South Central Kentucky in some way. Maybe not a massive glacier coming down I-65 or some dramatic drought for 10, 15 years, but as Dr. Mahmood says, prices, refugees, political unrest, the fact that we are militarily engaged in other parts of the world, it's all connected to changing climate patterns that affect geopolitical issues.
You talked about being at a conference, and one of your colleagues made a joke about the clouds that they send there in the water. Share that story.
Yes, a colleague at large from Carnegie Mellon University mentioned that, and most of us were in that meeting from this part, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois. And she was being from Pennsylvania. She mentioned that, well, you know, you send all these polluted clouds to us because, you know, in the mid-latitude goes from west to east, but then we send all the polluted water back to you through Ohio River. You know, so that also shows that even locally so close to us, we are how much connected we are. We just cannot ignore what is happening in Pennsylvania.
Which may seem many states away, but it has an impact.
Right, exactly.
The dollars and cents, the economics of climate change. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to take a short break here on Outlook. When we come back, we'll be talking about how it's going to affect your pocketbook. Stay with us, won't you? The Paris climate talks, global warming, climate change. How does it affect you? Welcome back to Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. On the program, we are welcoming back Dr. David Keeling and Dr. Rezaul Mahmood. And we've been talking in the first segment about those talks and really how it's going to affect those of us living in Kentucky. So if you will, just recap for us the fact that we have to be more open-minded about how interconnected we really are.
Yes, and climate is not changing Kentucky. It doesn't mean that it is not changing somewhere else. when you talk about global warming, a lot of times that comes to our mind that, okay, it is happening in Arctic, why do I care? But we care because it affects, there is a downstream effect of that. So that's why we care, and we are not going to have equal impact. Not everybody is going to have 5 degrees warming or 2 degrees warming. Some places they may not get warm much, but they may have changes in rainfall pattern, and that affects your entire economic activity, that how you do your business. So, so we are interconnected, and as I mentioned, that if drought in California, I mean, this is a significant historic drought that is definitely affecting our pocketbook, the price of fruits and vegetables, and they will go up. And that will have an impact. And if you think of California, I mean, as you say, this is on its own, I believe, it's the 7th largest economy in the world. So if California's economy doesn't do well, it's not good news for us as an entire
For
country.
everybody.
At all.
Can you ever prove or disprove this theory, this global warming? Because as I say, the debate we heard today from a Republican presidential candidate, who was pretty much determined that this was just a partisan issue in the U.S. and there was no meat to this issue of global warming.
Well, I mean, as I said early on, this is the science. I mean, they just need to check the science,
Follow
the
that
data,
science.
and everything is out there in the public domain that tells you what it is. So there is nothing out. As I said, there's an uncertainty. There's all science has uncertainties. There always fine tuning needs to be done. So that's a continuing work, but it does not change the underlying learning. In this case, we know the planet is getting warm. So that has not changed. So it's, if politicians say that's, I look at it as an opinion, you know. So that's up to them what they're going to
Well,
say.
you
and
know,
not
you
say.
referenced an ice age, you referenced science, you referenced, you know, we look at history. With all that we have at our fingertips now for knowledge, what have we learned? Have we learned?
We have learned that from a political perspective, we only have the ability to look at change in a very short human time frame. And I think most of the conflict, the political debate about climate change is about the relative temporal element of the relationship between climate and humans. And we're not able to see hundreds, thousands, generations, millennia in the future. We just don't have that capacity in our political system. And you know what politicians and our listeners need to be thinking about is opportunities, economic opportunities created by changing climates. And if we focus on opportunities rather than the debate about is it or isn't it, that's an irrelevant debate. Focus on the opportunities created by a changing world climatologically, geopolitically, economically, culturally. That's where our political energy particularly must be focused.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned, that there's a cost for action and there's a cost for inaction. And recently in another interview, I mentioned that a lot of the countries, particularly the Europeans, really way ahead in the green technology and all of this. And they're going to be offering them, selling them to others.
Aha.
So are we going to be behind the curve, catching up, or we want to be ahead in the game as
Proactive.
being proactive? Exactly.
That's a good point. If we look at the globe, at the picture, can you point a finger at that country is really bad, that country is really good? And when you're at these talks, these climate talks, you know, are those countries who are offenders, are they having the finger pointed at them, and are they being called to the table to say, well, you're going to have to work a little harder?
Well, I think you have to dig down into the sort of structure of the economy. People always point to China as being one of the biggest polluters, yet China currently is the largest by dollar investor in alternative technologies, high-speed rail, trying to develop new green technologies in energy production and mobilities, etc. Now, if you look at the smog alerts in Beijing this week, you'd say, wow, you know, nothing's happening in China. Here's the United States, theoretically the most technologically advanced country in the world, and we are the absolute worst in investing as a nation in alternative technologies or new ideas about adapting to changing
why is
climates.
that?
Because we have political gridlock. We have no leadership or imagination in Washington right? There's that joke about if only we had 3 wise men in Washington to celebrate the the holiday season, right? It's because we think so short term about change, and we need to be thinking generationally about investing in this
in the
stuff.
future.
Yeah.
It's what you said, until it hits home, until it's in your backyard, you really don't know what to do. And the changing science, so you can get to a place where you can be proactive and work towards some common goal, but then, as you mentioned, the climate is always changing.
Yes.
It can fool us and come back around and things change again.
Yes, and on that, I would like to also make, before I respond to that, that my earlier comment that, the politicians, the way science work is that it's politically motivated. It is not possible for me to politically motivate. I can tell you why. When I work on a scientific research project, I put my entire career on the line,
Right.
literally. So, because if I do a bad job, it will start from my department. This department has job to keep checking that
Oversee.
whether we are
Right.
doing things right. It goes to the funding agencies, and it immediately gets reported in the academic literature that somebody is academic fraud. Okay, so it is just not possible because the checks and balances in the system that we cannot do politically motivated science. When it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's failed hypothesis. So that is one part of it. The other part of it is that I want to mention that about political gridlock and things like that. That even if you are, say, humans are not causing climate change. Assume that climate is not changing.
Okay.
But we will have floods, we will have droughts. These are natural cycle of the system. They will continue to happen. And if we are proactive tackling those, which you do, in some extent, different states, some are very proactive, some are less proactive, will still be a long way dealing with in terms of climate change impacts. So that's very important that in the meantime, what do we do when, in a democratic system, we have debates, we have gridlock, we can't do anything about it. But even the things that we can agree on, if we continue to do that, we'll still be better off in the long run tackling when we come to an agreement that, okay, we need to do something.
And certain states are known for their green awareness, okay? Certain states are greener. We have a new governor in the state of Kentucky sworn in this week as we record this program. To date, no comment on what his position is going to be on some of those things. He did appoint a coal I was going to say magnate, but someone from the coal industry to run the cabinet on the environment for the state of Kentucky. How important is it that at the state level we have someone who supports this proactivity when it comes to climate?
I think it's not all that important that you have a coal person in that position in the big scheme of things. I think it is important in the sense that if the leadership doesn't recognize that the coal industry must change and Kentucky must change in how it addresses these issues, then we're not going to make any progress as a state economically or politically. And so my hope is that there's some recognition in Frankfurt that Kentucky is part of a bigger system. It's part of a global integrated process. And if we just look at this stuff homogeneously, we're going to make mistakes, and mistakes will cost us.
And mistakes will cost us. We're quickly running out of time. What about these Paris climate talks? Do you anticipate that something indeed will come from them, or is it just another step along the way and a lot of rhetoric?
Yes, I cannot predict that, but I would also like to say that these talks, we had Copenhagen, we had Kyoto and others, but we made progress along the line.
So every one we get a little, we push that rock up the hill just a little further?
Exactly. And we may not have as all nations coming one agreement, but it provided the thoughts for other nations that a lot of them are taking steps on their own. They're not waiting for a global scale agreement. So that's a good thing. That's a positive thing.
And I believe an agreement of some substance will come out of this in some way. The Chinese are eager to do something because they recognize the negative impacts on their society. The United States obviously is keen to do something to show leadership at the international level. So I think there'll be something concrete that'll come out of it. Where the rubber hits the road is implementation.
You know, we talked a lot about politicians, we talked a lot about leaders. You know, the day-to-day citizen, the average person on the street, do they care about this issue, climate change and global warming?
I do think they do. It's sometimes consciously, sometimes subconscious level. But more we discuss these things, they're probably more aware. But I see a lot of people around me that I found very surprisingly how much they are aware of these issues.
They're aware?
Yes.
Ah.
So, and sometimes they would not say it's a climate change, but they would say energy efficiency.
Okay.
They will take those steps. So that's, I think, positive. We are interested in the end result. At the end, if we can reduce emissions of harmful gases to the atmosphere and slow down this warming process or warming rate, that's a good news.
I'm going to give you a final word before we wrap things up, but in our lifetimes, will we see greater effects of global warming?
Boy, projection-wise, yes. You know, that's, you know, if we live until 2040,
Okay.
you know, here in Kentucky, around here, yes.
2040.
Yes.
So it's that close.
Is that close?
So
Yeah.
to think that it's
Yeah,
a century
yeah,
out or
right.
down the road is silly.
And I'm
close.
talking about Kentucky, where it is not that impacted. California, west of Colorado, they are already getting it.
So it's headed our way. But no gloom and doom.
No gloom
No
and doom.
gloom and doom. There is, as Dr. Keeling mentioned, there's lots of opportunities out there that we can actually, that's what Californians are doing.
That's right. Opportunity.
Opportunity because the air that Kentuckians breathe, the water that Kentuckians drink, the jobs that they do, the soil that they farm is not solely part of Kentucky. It comes from elsewhere. And if you don't understand that elsewhere impacts us right here, then you're living in an alternative reality. And I think Kentuckians are starting to understand that. I think the green movement is broadening dramatically, that citizens are starting to understand that we're part of something bigger.
So one person can make a difference.
One person can make a huge difference.
I did not pay him to do that segue, but when we come back, we're going to tell you how you, as one person, can make a difference as we meet WKU Sustainability Coordinator. Stay with us, won't you? Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're coming to you from our very green studio here on the campus of Western Kentucky University. This is Talking Heads on a Mission. Our mission today was to enlighten you about the Paris Climate Conference and what that means for us in Kentucky. We're taking it one step further as we welcome to the program Christian Ryan, who is the WKU Sustainability Coordinator. And, you know, we talked earlier in the earlier two segments with Dr. Keeling and Dr. Mahmood about how one person can make a difference. I mean, that's hard to believe, but we can.
Oh.
But before you go any further, you have to explain, when we hear the word reducing your carbon footprint, what does that mean?
Oh, so, well, reducing your carbon footprint basically means reducing your contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, right? So, you know, the best way to understand your carbon footprint is to go and calculate it. And there's really easy ways to do that. And so, you know, my old boss always used to use that saying, you know, you cannot manage what you do not measure, right? And so I feel that way about our carbon footprint. Understanding what behaviors in our lives most contribute to our carbon emissions helps us know where we can make reductions, right? Where we
Gotcha.
can make improvements and make better decisions. So one of my top tips is for people to just calculate their carbon footprint. And there's an EPA, you can just easily Google it. EPA has a carbon footprint calculator. And you just go in and enter some general information on your lifestyle. And it'll give you a nice idea of what areas in your life, what things you do are carbon intensive.
Wow, and I bet a lot of people, once they do that, are very surprised when they see, whoa, didn't realize that. So if we're watching this program, we heard earlier from the scientists about the Paris Climate Summit and global warming and those kinds of things. And while it may be, several years down the road before we experience some of those ramifications, what can we do now to make a difference?
There are so many things that we can do right now. So if you look at the United States carbon footprint, right? So where are our greenhouse gas emissions coming from? The number one source of our greenhouse gas emissions are related to energy, and specifically electricity production, right? And so if you think about, okay, so how can I reduce my electricity use on a personal level? All kinds of ways, and I brought one of my favorite tools. This is a smart strip surge protector, and the way that this works is that I don't know if people realize, like, anything in your house, any electronic, even when it's turned off, it's still drawing power, right? And so what you have to do is turn it off at the outlet, and a really easy way to do that is get a smart power strip and switch the entire thing off. So you're basically you're taking your electronics off standby, which is still drawing power, and completely turning them off. And so you're reducing your electricity use and also your electricity bill, right? And so it's benefits in several ways. And so just simple things like that. When you leave your cell phone charger plugged into the wall, even when your phone's not charging, it's still drawing power. Unplug it. Really simple, small things that we can all be doing can make a huge difference.
Those are good, easy tips. We're hearing a lot, and certainly this region of the state is very proactive when it comes to local. Buying local, growing local, eating local. And while that's a wonderful thing, people may not realize why that's important in the carbon footprint.
Well, okay, so that's perfect. That's a perfect point, because number two, our number two biggest carbon emissions in the United States is related to transportation. So a lot of that transportation is transporting goods back and forth across the country, and food is huge. So much of our produce is coming from California. So much of our produce is actually coming from outside the country.
Yes.
So eating local is a wonderful, very effective way to reduce your carbon footprint. So yes, if you think about the transportation related and all the goods that you consume, just being more mindful to anything that you can get local to do so, yes, that makes a huge difference.
Mindful, note that word. That was a great choice of words. And so much of it is just being mindful of what you're doing and that you are making a difference. You brought your own glass, you brought your own water.
I do. This is my mason jar that I use for absolutely everything. I try not to, in my own personal life, I try not to use plastic. If you think about that plastic, it comes from petroleum, which is a fossil fuel. So every single piece of plastic in your life contributes to carbon emissions in its manufacture and on down the line when we somehow either recycle or send it, heaven forbid, send it to the landfill. So, carbon is embedded in all the products that we use, all the services that we use. And so yes, exactly, just being mindful of that helps you make better decisions and better choices.
And I hope that you've learned something from this. Christian Ryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Now, Christian, of course, runs the WKU sustainability area. And earlier in the program, you heard from Dr. David Keeling, Dr. Rezaul Mahmood, and we've been talking about climate change and how you, as one person, can make a difference. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're so glad you joined us. Thanks for being here.